Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast. Today is episode one. I'm once again joined by Keith Preston, Florian, and Alek. Glad to have you guys back. Today's discussion topic is games and education. And by that, what I mean games as an aid or a facilitator to education. So, growing up in the 90s, there was a lot of edutainment, both TV shows geared for children and young adults, and games to help do two things. One, encourage people to learn, and then also, for example, the children, or to facilitate learning. And you might see more of that with like video games. So, for example, in my case, Age of Empires, the video game in the late 90s, was instrumental in making me historically aware and then interested in these broader topics. I mean, you could argue that Age of Empires, without it, I wouldn't be doing this show right now, right? That's how important it was, because that was how I first was met or encountered historical stuff. So most education generally, again, you have like Montessori and liberals and the left, where I guess they do try to mix this a little bit. But you have more traditional forms of education where someone will be like, well, effective, or that's just pandering to children or whatever, right? So let's begin by defining the terms here, right? Well, what's education? Well, as I've said before on this channel, education is the means by which you teach people how to think, right? Giving them the tools to reason and think and solve problems, okay? And that can be roughly divided into two categories: reasoning from a premise to a conclusion, which we call reasoning forwards, and then reasoning from an observed phenomena to its cause, which is reasoning backwards. So that's education. And then games can be seen as simulations, right? So, for example, children throughout history would play, or even animals in nature would engage in mock versions of what adults do. That would be an informal game. And what that does is the stakes are low and it looks kind of silly, but what ends up happening is that these people, or these children, or even young animals, are mimicking those traits that they'll have to do when they get older. But games, in a sort of scientific sense, as simulations for real life, specifically in its first iteration, war, comes from Prussia and the idea of Kriegsspiel, which is the first war game. There were earlier iterations. Kriegsspiel is both the name of a game and the concept of a genre of games, so it's kind of confusing. It also is considered one of the forerunners of Dungeons and Dragons. And actually, Dungeons and Dragons evolves out of Kriegsspiel and war games. And so now, if you have governments that have general staffs and naval branches and army branches playing tabletop games with dice to role play different scenarios, it seems plainly obvious that gaming can be an aid to learning how to handle real world challenges. Now, obviously, education in the broad sense is not, going to train you to go to war. That's not the point. The point that I'm getting at, though, is that you could treat the game as a simulation in order to prepare somebody for something real, right? And so we have now a whole galaxy of simulation games, themes like farming sims. There's all sorts of management sims. One can think of the Railroad Tycoon, Roller Coaster Tycoon, and Zoo Tycoon games from the 90s. Yeah, sure. They're all streamlined. They're all simplified. And certain war games can be quite complex, even on the open market, right? So the point is, though, games can be used as simulations for real life. And then that's what I mean when I say that games can be integrated into education. So one of the early attempts was Oregon Trail, which was originally developed in 1971. I remember playing Oregon Trail 3 in the late 90s, which is sort of like integrating history with a multimedia interactive with light management. You had to manage resources and keep your settlers alive and so on. And I thought it was really fun as a kid, and it definitely encouraged me to keep going into history. And so you could envision, even without video games, using the more traditional tabletop pencil and paper game, running a campaign like Oregon Trail using some D&D rules, where then you grade the students based on how they solve problems, how much they immerse themselves in character in the game, right? So you're learning about the West, and then when they play these characters, you're going to then grade them on how well they read the source material and acted like somebody from that time period. And then, maybe problem solving, that would be another thing you could grade them on. And that would be a way to mix up and get people more engaged. And also, there's the famous anecdote that, Kissinger played diplomacy. So again, that is another interesting anecdote as well. That for these high stakes players on the world stage, they do use games as simulations and aids. It's not a replacement, of course, but it's an aid to these things. And so, given that we also have the broader educational challenges of getting people who, as we mentioned before, need lots of remediation because they weren't properly educated in the first place, and they have trouble reading anything more complicated than a comic book, this could be a way to ease them back in so that, hey, look, there's that. So that's my basic premise. We'll go to you, Florian.
All right, yeah, fun topic. I would concur with what Todd said. I may add some details like the history of gaming. I mean, you can also see chess as kind of like a strategy simulation game, a very early one, right? But if you really look at games, you have like board games like the Landlord's game that became Monopoly in 1903, like very early in the 20th century. And you have basically various military strategy games that probably devolved out of the need or demand in the military to have these strategy game, right? There's a funny post on X where they said where they highlighted that the Japanese actually war gamed the Midway battle, and the generals gave the lowly ranked officers the role of the Americans, and the lowly ranked officers attacked from the north and totally creamed the generals in that game. And the Japanese very logically then reacted by eliminating the option to attack from the north, because why would the Americans attack from the north, right? So then the generals won the game again, but we know that the Americans then attacked from the north at Midway. So you also have to, and that's maybe maybe like a kind of a criticism of games, right? You can cheat, or you can basically focus on immediate reward, and then you don't learn much of it, right? So that would be one criticism that you could have, that games always focus on reward in the here and now, and then real processes sometimes take a while. On the other hand, you have games like Oregon Trail, which didn't make it easy for the games for the gamers, right? And then you have Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? That was another game that came out in the 80s, where you had to engage in geography sense, have to look for someone. There were games like Mass Blaster, and then in the 90s you had basically the golden age of computer games, right? SimCity, Civilization, they all allowed you to simulate an entire growth of entire civilization or of a city. You had something called SETI at Home, SETI, and Folded, and both were attempts for research groups to outsource their research to others. Like Folded was a game where people could try to fold proteins, and protein folding was something very difficult to understand, and so scientists tried to use that approach to how do you call it, to crowdsource their research, right? To have people suggest other ways for amino acids to fold into a protein, and so on. And CT at Home was also the attempt of finding extraterrestrial life by farming out the computing power to everyone. And I guess everyone learned also something with you that installed at home. And then in the 2010s, you had like many apps were starting to be gamified, right? Duolingo is gamified, and others. I don't know much about that, but there's many simulations that came up that were basically trying to teach people something by employing real game mechanisms. And sometimes some classes, they would have these economy simulations, right? Where you have to lead, like, for example, in one game, you have a bicycle shop, and you have to basically do over 7 years, do 7 simulated years, do the correct decisions to have that bicycle shop expand worldwide. And so these simulations are also used for real. I mean, it's just in online classes. And so in the future, we'll have more AR, augmented reality, virtual reality, because what people can do with augmented reality, that means basically you look through glasses on a reality, and then you can put some extra fictional picture on that reality. For example, if you're an engineer, you can have these AR goggles, and then you can try out different ways of assembling a motor. It's right in front of you, and you can basically, what happens if I put the pipe here, right? And then you see it right there whether it will work without really assembling the motor yet. That's very helpful. I also heard they do it for crime scene analysis in the police force, right? So basically you can analyze blood splatters and then say, hey, where might that murder have occurred? Where did this guy shoot the person, the victim, by analyzing blood splatters and all kind of stuff like that. So surgery, the same. You can learn how to do surgery without having a real patient, but it looks like you have the real apparatus in front of you. So yeah, the successes of games are you have improved motivation, enhanced spatial reasoning, and all that. You bridge theoretical and practical understanding, and you get feedback from the users how they learn. But of course, there's a difficulty of aligning games with the curricular standards that can be hard. Sometimes people say not everyone has the same access to technology, which may be true. Teachers are often not really hip on games, right? It may be different now, but in the 90s, teacher wouldn't know anything about games. And then, as I said before, there's a risk of focusing on competition and rewards over the learning process itself, right? You look for the quick shortcut to win the game rather than really going through the entire motion. Because games give you a different incentive, and reality doesn't often give you an immediate win, right? Sometimes you do need to sit down and learn, and there's no real shortcut. Games may teach you that there is a shortcut. So that's what I would say.
All right, Alek.
Well, one of the most common criticisms of education today is that it's overly passive. And Todd, as you mentioned, the whole point of education is to teach people how to think, how to learn. It's not so much what you know, but how you know what you know. Critical thinking, critical analysis. These skills are to be cultivated independently through creative initiative, through curiosity, and through metacognition, reflection on one's own thinking. Now, if a student is confined to a very passive environment, obviously they'll have little incentive to learn to think critically, unless they're an especially motivated student. On the other hand, games can empower students to take the initiative, to push themselves to learn without being penalized for not learning well, without being graded. Chess is a case in point. In chess, a competitive player gains rating points for winning, loses them for losing. Drawing, it depends on the other player's rating. So chess is an example of self-motivated learning, but here is also a limitation of games. Now, Todd, it's interesting that you mentioned Age of Empires. I've played that game too when I was a younger man. I played on the MSN Gaming Zone, and I've noticed that a lot of the fairly cerebral people like that game. So, and what I've noticed, however, is that I've had a difficult time convincing my classmates that Age of Empires is a fun game. Most of them mocked it. They thought it was nerdy. They thought it was just not as exciting as an RPG or a shooting game. It's not something that you can easily inspire many students to take up. Chess is even more restrictive. You see that you have to have a special kind of aptitude, a special kind of talent, a special kind of a background of knowledge to like chess. Most of the intelligent people whom I know have little to no interest in learning chess. And the same is true for many competitive games that you may find out there. So, okay, the advantage of games is that it teaches students to think critically, to take initiative, to take responsibility, to engage in self-guided learning. Unschooling is another relevant concept here. You see, I'm a big fan of unschooling as that empowers the gifted people to actualize their potential. Yet, if you try to universalize that. If you try to unschool all of the children, you'll have a disaster in your head. And that's my critique of integrating gaming into the university curriculum or even a public school curriculum. It will inevitably alienate the vast majority of learners who actually need a highly structured approach with scheduled deadlines and specific instructions and clear guidelines to follow, such as page numbers, rubric, and so on and so on. That's what we deal with at academic imposition quite a bit. So it'd be nice if we lived in a world where this was not necessary and we could just all game our way through academic classes, but I don't see that to be realistic.
Okay, teacher here. So, what do you think about all this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was never a gamer personally. I think the last time I played a video game was when Space Invaders was the thing, and that was about 45 years ago. So definitely not a gamer guy here. And I was never a tech person generally. As far as the use of games in education, this reminds me of a student I had once who asked why we don't use cartoons for instruction in my classes. And I said, because we don't have a preschool division in the university. But I do think, though, that the use of certain kinds of these, audiovisual technologies are certainly helpful. When I was a kid, I don't know if this is still around or if any of you guys have seen it. I think Florian's about 10 years from me, younger than me, and Todd and Alek are, I think, 20 years younger. But there was this thing called Schoolhouse Rock that used to be popular. It was often, there were these little cartoons that were shown on television, just regular, television, usually in the afternoons, and usually they lasted a few minutes, and they would come on the air in between shows, almost like a commercial or something like that. But it was cartoons where these, you have these goofy little songs that illustrated some kind of, academic concept. The one I remember is they had a little song illustrating the meaning of zero in a mathematical sense, and it was called "A Zero's My Hero." And the reason I remember it is that in school, whenever we get a zero on a grade for misbehavior or something like that, we'd start singing "A Zero is My Hero." But I do think some of that was somewhat educational in terms of its overall value. I've never tried teaching with games. That seems like a bit much, but I certainly have done teaching with video material. There's a video series called Crash Course that's intended for basically, lower level undergrads, maybe advanced high school students. That illustrates a lot of, academic concepts. It's not so much a cartoon. It's usually someone speaking who has an appropriate academic background, but it's presented in an entertainment-like way with, all the standard stuff you see on YouTube, the illustrations and, all the goofy stuff. And I've used the social science material from Crash Course to teach undergrads at, freshman and sophomore level undergrads, not so much in the upper levels. So that kind of thing is helpful. I do think people seem to grasp material pretty well when they have exposure to some of that kind of stuff, as long as it doesn't veer off into just sheer entertainment, where it's no longer about education, it's just about entertainment. The designing curriculum where you actually interact with something like a game, it reminds me a bit of when I worked in HR. There was one of the companies I worked for had a training system where new people that came into the company, they would do these online training programs where they learned about company policies and procedures and all the usual stuff. And these were very interactive. It was almost like, playing a video game or something like that. You'd have all these little videos where actors are playing company employees and little skits they're doing about what to do or what not to do. This was in a retail business, so a lot of it had to do with customer service and that kind of stuff. And that seemed to be very useful as far as the training process. I know in this particular business, we were dealing often with employees that weren't exactly high IQ employees. So the video training system seemed to help them grasp some of the things that they might not have grasped in a, a more of a seminar, lecture type training seminar. So, it's something that seems to have promise, but I've never used it or have any real experience with it, so I wouldn't know.
Right. So let me try to go a little bit deeper, maybe with the admission that we're going, if we're going to do this, and this is what I'm proposing, we have layers of complexity, right? So complex, right? You're in the Naval War Academy and you're role-playing for Warplane Orange in 1939. Yes, the U.S. Navy actually did play games to prepare for the Pacific Theater in World War II. So we know that it works in the sense of training you to act and achieve real-world goals. We know that. Now, it's only done in... But I don't see why you couldn't have like a management sim for someone who wants to, run a bar, right? Or like Zoo Tycoon, right? No, but actually make it like more scientific. Those games were fun, but they weren't meant to be like a scientific training, like say Kriegsspiel was. That would be the high level once you narrow down the people you're working with. Right, that would not be suitable for, say, high school or college or anything like that. It's too specialized, too complicated. Early on, though, and this is where I want to go back to the idea of Oregon Trail. Obviously, you don't need computers for this, right? That's why I brought up D&D and Kriegsspiel. You can use pen, paper, and dice. You need a dungeon master, the person who runs the actual game. That would be the teacher or maybe an assistant who would participate in it. So you could just take the idea, you start out in St. Louis and you got to get either to California or Washington State, right? And so you then have to go through all these steps. And maybe it's a campaign that has like, I don't know, say six runs. These are like, key points along the Westward Trail, right? And so that could be used to integrate, because what will often happen is when students are reading about history, they're going to be like, well, how did, they have a hard time immersing themselves into the mindset of the period of time they're reading about. Something like an Oregon attempt to fix that. And I think there was potential, but it just... And what I'm saying is, say in high school, you could have like a 6-session campaign where your class goes from then to, say, Portland, right? As they go west. Have to, play by the rules. So you have to be immersive. You have to act like a 19th century settler, not be part of the grade. Part of the grade would be problem solving. So here's the thing. How you implement, you put the ideas into someone's head. That's not what I'm talking about. Educated the student, or in the process of educating the student, you then that we've been giving you as a teacher. How do you, right? That's the how to think part, right? The critical thinking part. And then also the immersion. Well, why should we learn about somebody trying to settle the American frontier in the 19th century? Well, this is what it would have been like for them, right? It kind of gives you connection, or at least can, if done right, palpable and real to the student, right? That's very general. I mean, you don't really have to have specialized knowledge. Only the person running the game would have to have that. And a teacher, it could just be, I don't know, contracted D&D master, right, Florian, or something like that. And then you could do that. And I don't see why get more and more complex to the professional level. Again, war colleges run war games. Pencil, they probably use computers now, but it was pencil and paper back in the day. So. And this was interesting, right? We have this two-tier view of the world where, on the one hand, we say, oh, X is impractical, X is dumb, and we're just not going to do it in civilian life. The government and the military doesn't think like that. They're like, no, we are going to do this because it works, because it allows us to run simulations and then make plans accordingly. And I think the reason why this is not something that is more widely accepted in civilian life is because the powers that be don't want us to be able to solve problems. I mean, if we were playing, if we had a leisure society that was not rooted in, say, sports teams and these utterly, asinine run circus entertainment, but instead, simulation gaming where people play these games, you would probably have a population better able to achieve goals in their own lives and challenge the status quo. And they don't want that. Florian.
Yeah, very good point. I think we have seen that already in the last 20, 30 years. I think a large part of the rise of the tech autocracy is due to games. That was all of a sudden something, the emergence of computers and then the internet was something that all of a sudden gave nerds, classic nerds, right, gave them the option to get status for themselves, right? And many of these people, they are like Zuckerberg and others, Mark Andreessen and others. They all started out on the computer, and I bet these people have been, or many of those people have been using basically an approach that was more playful and gamified themselves, right? I mean, starting an online business was probably a very like a little game for them, but they just played it in reality. And I mean, normal people don't have an idea how nerds are actually playing. I'm not talking about people that casually play Candy Crush. I'm talking about people that that basically, I know, for example, someone who had like a game, was an adventure game. I think it was King's Quest, one of the slightly older games in the 90s. And he went, and you basically had to go through rooms, pick up hidden objects, and solve quests. And he would basically go through every room, have a list where he wrote down every object he touched, every corner he went to, very systematically, and in a basically brute force approach. And this is what nerds did in various incarnations. And in a way, this was akin to like a football jock practicing every day, and they were basically programming and gaming every day. So it has, you could say, and to what Keith said, that basically most people wouldn't do gaming, and I think it's because games have to be dumbed down a lot, like level of Candy Crush, to be of benefit to many people. Otherwise, you just have nerds who play games that doesn't really move the needle, but they are getting a little bit better, right? The people that played game, Age of Empires and all the kind of stuff, maybe they weren't as popular, but there were certain type of people, me and my friends, for example, who liked to play these games. But we were already learning for school and everything. We were nerds, so the games made us a little bit better, but they didn't necessarily help anyone else. And later on, this then developed into some people became very successful with online businesses. Those were the classical nerds, and so it's a personality issue who profits from gaming, right? But there's also examples of, like, if you look at the craze about Pokemon Go, you still remember 10 years ago, you had to collect like little Pokemon balls, like a black, white, red ball. They were hidden somewhere over town. You basically had to go with your cell phone and pick it up there, and then you can collect points that way. That's a gamification that basically is Candy Crush on a large scale, right? That kind of helps everyone if you implement a game like that, and that may also be popular with most people and will help many people. But nowadays it seems a little bit you have to tell people very, very basic things for them to profit from it, and so you could think that may be a bit of a waste. But I think in the future you'll have gamification, but it needs to be specifically, like, I don't want to say dumbed down, but made more accessible to people that aren't already nerds.
Keith.
I'm thinking that this kind of thing may be helpful when it comes to instructing students at the more lower levels. I'm thinking like the K through 12 levels more so than the university level, or particularly like the elementary school level. I gave the example of Schoolhouse Rock and Crash Course and stuff like that in the previous segment. I'm a little skeptical about the utility of this the more advanced education becomes. I mean, unless it's something that's purely interactive, like some kind of technical training, that's one thing. But things that are more abstract, I tend to be a little more skeptical of. I tend to think that um, there's no substitute for actually reading books and essays and more traditional methods of learning, like lecture discussion and those kinds of things, because I think there's too much emphasis on games and technological methods of instruction. You're going to lose the interactive component. I've noticed this from dealing with students who are used to doing online instruction, distance education as it used to be called, but now so much of higher education is done online. There's something about that kind of process where no matter how sophisticated you make it, you still lose the interconnective aspect that you have from actually having a live instructor where you're engaging in other students. Just doing posts on a discussion board, it doesn't cut it. That's like doing education by Facebook or something like that. I think that when that interactive aspect is lost, a big part of the educational process is undermined, because education a lot of times correlates with the building of interactive interpersonal relationships. A lot of people, when they think about what they learned the most from as students, whether it's whatever level, whether it's K through 12 or university level, they'll often remember a particular instructor, a particular professor, particular students that were in the class, and they'll think that was an exceptionally good class because the professor's method of delivery, the interaction between the students and the professor, the interaction with the students with each other, that made it a really good quality instructional scenario. And none of that exists in this kind of technological format. I mean, if you have online classes, for example, you're not going to even remember the instructor's name if you ever knew it. Again, it's like teaching through Facebook and Twitter or something. I'm a little skeptical of the utility of that in terms of the ability of these kinds of technological systems to really replace more traditional methods of learning, except for when it just comes to learning basic technological skills.
Right. So to address a couple of points here, because Florian, you and Keith have brought up similar concerns. So Florian brought up the wargaming concern with the Midway by the Japanese officers. We saw something in the U.S. context in 2001 or 2 with the Millennial Challenge war game, where Marine General Riper basically just reams the U.S. forces playing as like Iran or the terrorists by using unconventional tactics. And they're like, okay, stop the game, can't do this anymore. And then, they win, of course, right? But that's the same problem you pointed out, Florian. So yeah, absolutely. Even in the elite levels, a war game only is as good as the fidelity of the people running it to what we know could be possible. So any simulation, because not all simulations are games, and not all games are simulations, but you can make a game which is a pretty good simulation. And because again, if you're in like West Point, of course you have to read books and write papers and go to class, but you still also play war games as a part of your training. So it's not either or, it's both and, right? And the other thing too is this is very scientific. So let's imagine you're running let's not talk about games at all. Let's say you want to study the effect of, say, corrosion on metal, right? Well, you'd have a testing control, one of which is exposed to an accelerated rate of corrosion and one of which is not. And then you could then make some predictions about what would happen under these conditions. Well, a game designed to be a simulation does just that. What does a war game do? Well, you're not going to actually, fight that country all these different times, maybe only once, right? If you fight them at all. But you can then run through all of these hypothetical scenarios. Now, that's more of an elite level thing, and we wouldn't want to have someone like in high school doing that. But when it comes to immersion, like I said, with the Oregon Trail, that might be suitable for middle school or high school. And the other thing as well with this is that this is what, no, this is more for history, right? And I don't know if it's going to be as true for other fields of study, but one of the most difficult things to get modern people to do is to step outside of their bubble of modern convenient technology and imagine how people lived lives before that. And you can't actually ever recreate those material conditions completely, but what you can do is you can get people to role play as settlers on the frontier and work at imagining what it would have been like, and they'll be graded on that, right? If you can't, because like, what's the point of teaching kids about, high schoolers about the frontier if they never internalize the challenges and the decisions that were made, right, by everybody involved, right? It just becomes hard for the student to relate to, right? And we can then further specify this as if your students being in a role-playing game, being led by your teacher on, say, the Oregon Trail, you're not the one driving the game. You're not passive. You're involved. You're playing it, but you're not driving it. The driver of the game is the teacher. With a war game where two sides are, moving chits on a board to fight each other, everybody involved is directing the game, right? So, and that's something that you would get more from advanced individuals. And again, Go, the ancient Japanese game of Go, was played by samurai. I mean, in order not only to just have leisurely activity, but to build a strategic mindset. It builds a mindset, right? They're not just doing this because, oh, hey, I'm bored, it's fun. There's plenty of leisurely activities a samurai could have done, but they had a culture of mutually reinforcing ceremony as well, of creating a mindset, and that's another thing too. So, just to briefly summarize these 3 points, the one is, you have a game that is, teacher directed, which would be the role-playing game I talked about. And then you have where every participant is directing some part of the game, like in a war game, you're moving chits on a board. And then thirdly, it generates a mindset. In this case, what it would have been like to be somebody from that time in history, right? And that's sort of what Oregon Trail was meant to do in the first place. And just for everybody who's watching, unfortunately, I heard from Alek, his Wi-Fi is not working, so he may not come back, unfortunately. But Florian.
Yeah, I think I got the idea of we could do Oregon Trail as an MMORPG, right? I mean, multi online role playing game. Yeah, and you can have that in schools. Of course, the Wokes have rigged a little bit havoc on all these clones of World of Warcraft. Right, you won't have blue-haired freaks in the settlements, but maybe it's still something they can learn from. I mean, those guys, the woke would probably die pretty quickly in an online role-playing game of Oregon Trail. But this is still viable, and it's still a good idea to get people out of their comfort zone, or just to have people serve on board a virtual battle cruiser or destroyer or submarine. I'm sure they're doing some version of that in military academies already. But there's also another aspect to gaming. If you think the next incarnation of gaming would be VR, AR, virtual reality, augmented reality, which I mentioned before has great functions and is used professionally in several instances, there's the economic aspect to it. These Google glasses or Meta View, whatever they were called, there was, if you remember, 5 years ago, they all came on market, and it was an unwieldy goggle, and they were expensive. And I don't think these things are yet a thing yet. What I mean is that not many people are wearing them because they are wieldy and expensive, and especially in economic times as we have now, it's not an attractive proposition. So the evolution to VR, AR will probably take some while still. It may come eventually, but all the talk about AR and VR has all but died down, I realized, right? It was a big thing together with AI. People predicted there will be AI in 2017, 2018. Well, they got that right, but they also predicted there would be drones. They also got that right, but the VR, AR stuff, that kind of lags behind. It's probably because of economic reality. But in general, I think, I think the more I think that the step has to go towards interactivity, and people can be interactive with their phone already, right? Like, especially that's the best way to reach them. So if you have some way to have some game that you can play on your phone where you interact with others and kind of simulate the topic that you're learning, that may already be working.
Okay, Keith.
Well, whatever the utility of the use of this kind of technology and instruction, I do think it will probably be a wave of the future. Increasingly, I see educational processes becoming more and more technologized, where students are going to do a lot more interactive learning with technologies, particularly as educational institutions try to cut costs by eliminating instructors. I could very easily see instruction done in the future where you go to a class and you sit there in a cubicle and interact with the machine and do your assignments online, and there's no professor involved. There might, other than someone in the room facilitating the process, or maybe you won't even go to a classroom. You'll just do it on your laptop or tablet or phone or something. Increasingly, it does look like that kind of approach to education is becoming commonplace. And at the lower level, I think that may be the case as well. I think that increasingly there may be situations where kids are sitting there in school in front of some kind of tablet-like device, and they're doing a lot of interactive work with that, rather than having a teacher writing on the chalkboard and all the usual stuff there. So that, and technological advancement has that effect, for better or worse. And while I can see advantages to this kind of process in terms of the exposure to technologies and the breadth of information that's available that we have now, again, I think the loss of the human element is something that's concerning. I do think that is going to have the effect of creating this, wider issue of social isolation that we have nowadays. Now, nowadays, it's possible, it's technologically possible to get your entire K through 12 education online. You could be a homeschool kid, for example, where you're not even being schooled. You're just sat in front of a computer and you do your K through 12 online, until you're done with that. And then it's possible to enroll in one of these online degree mills or take online courses and get, not only your university education, but also your graduate school, even post-grad, done online. That's theoretically possible. It's theoretically possible nowadays to have a PhD without ever setting foot in a classroom. And I don't know that that's a good thing. There may be advantages to it on some level, but I do think there's serious disadvantages to it, particularly when we consider the amount of social isolation there is nowadays, in terms of, more and more people are working remotely, which I do myself, and I like it. But I do think that because we have increased social isolation, that people are not connecting in the workplace or in the neighborhood or in the educational system, that is contributing to mental health and other kinds of problems that we see nowadays as well. So there's, I guess there's ups and downs with all of this stuff.
My Keith, I never thought I'd see an anarchist defending the current education system. No, just kidding.
Well, until the ghost of Francisco Ferrer, becomes the minister of education, we're pretty much screwed, or at least A.S. Neal.
Yeah. So I think the other thing that's relevant here is with regards to socialization. I mean, that is important. So think of like the the ancient Aristotelian school of the Peripatetics, where they would all walk around and just do philosophy together. Sure, that's ideal, and I would like to see, but you can't walk around. See, that's really dumb. Just forcing people to sit all the time. We need to like make it, automatic again, like the Peripatetics, and just walk around while we're doing a lot of that. But see, here's the thing: we have this on paperwork, which is what a lot of modern schooling does. You didn't have that in ancient Greece, and you had classes that didn't do that. So there's something about the educational process that they knew that we've forgotten, and of course they actively cultivated it, which we're not doing now. So on the one hand, yeah, I don't think you should, live in a cube your whole life and not talk to people. But I'm gonna say something a little more edgy here, I guess. I think that the idea that the internet gives you this ability to give yourself, if you just put in the time, is great, because what it does is it breaks down the monopolistic control over education that these institutions have. I mean, a lot of these institutions, universities, many of them are state universities, right? So they're run by the government, and that has all sorts of negative long-term consequences with regards to incentives and what's taught and everything else. Profit, which isn't really that much better, because that also limits a lot of what you can say, do, and teach. Whereas if you have more, this is more I forget the term now. There was a group of tech anarchists back in the 90s and early 2000s that talked about how it was important to have the open, free flow of information. And yeah, I'm 100% behind that, right? The free flow of information. And, this is where John Chandler Gatto comes in with his reform theory of education. Now, when he was writing, the internet did not exist as it does now. So you obviously couldn't be doing this, right? It wouldn't in his day. Though I think we have the technology. And I actually am going to go on a limb for Daddy Elon here and say that Grok could probably just be a better teacher than the entire staff of Harvard. I mean, why not? I mean, first of all, Grok, okay, you've got the people that program it, right? But there's no politics with Grok. So let's say you're in a school environment with a classroom setting, right? There's the politics of the teachers. You got to make the teachers happy. You got to not do the things that upset them. Completely unrelated to the educational process. That's gone. Grok doesn't have feelings. Grok isn't going to get upset if you start, humming a tune while your teacher is, giving a lecture. Grok will, now there are downsides. Obviously, whoever trains Grok might train it on garbage, in which case, But for a generalized education, like say, certainly K through 12, even high school, you're going to get mostly correct answers. I mean, Grok isn't going to give you some, Reddit tier answer. For example, if you wanted to ask, I asked Grok this myself this year. Explain to me Maya engineering or Inca engineering strategies. They didn't have books. They didn't have writing. Like, how do you build Machu Picchu or suspension bridges? Well, Grok breaks it all down. I mean, you're not going to. Some books do, obviously, but good luck finding them. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say better than the entire staff of Harvard. Florian.
Well, as we all know, right, the Machu Picchu was probably built by aliens. But
right, yes.
I think now some people talked about walking in the chat. I think walking around may actually have a purpose, because it may implement knowledge that you have in your mind. I bet there are some people, at least, who if they walk around and learn and repeat things, they learn it better than if they just sit. So physical activity is actually a good thing, may even help with learning. And it may be also part of the future if people have like bodysuits with full immersion, and then they're in a future scenario, virtual reality, then they may get back to walking again, right? You also have these rigs where they're basically looking like a huge circle, and you stand in there, there's some railing, and then you can basically walk through a landscape with your VR goggles on and slay monsters like that. So So that's happening. That may come back. We may be more active than just sitting around in the future. Now, one thing is very important is that you can use AI now. You could design your own games, right? For example, if you want to train, if you're a salesman, and you want to train. What salesmen do, for example, is like basically they have their script, and then the customer comes up with some rebuttals and some arguments, and they also know these arguments because those arguments are always the same, and then they rebut those arguments until the customer is whittled down to buy. That could be simulated by AI, right? You could basically record your script and then write down how the customers answered, and then you feed it to an AI, and then the AI can help you train this, train thinking on your feet, train giving the customer the right story at the right time, and so on. And that way, you can gamify education that would actually help you for future roles, because all the rote learning and all the every employment that is based on automatic protocols, or if your job as an employee is something that can be automated, AI will take it away from you, right? So if you can, so in the future you will have need for programmers, of course, but also salespeople more. So AI would be a way to train these jobs as well, right? So you don't even need games that are given to you. You can program your own games with the AI, which may be an interesting future development. Certainly, you can say to Grok, please program a Space Invader version, and 30 seconds later you have it, and you can play Space Invaders on your computer. That's already possible. So maybe in the future, people will design their own games to learn. Of course, this means they need to be somewhat incentivized to learn, but if you want to get better at a job, that may be enough incentive for you.
All right, Keith. Let's see, you're still muted there, Keith. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that there should be a different models of education that are available, because different things work better for different people. There may be some people for whom this kind of technologized instructional methods that we're discussing work just fine, or perhaps maybe even work better. But I don't think it's for everyone. I think that we need to have models of education available that are going to be more in the interactive sense, because as Todd was saying, the Greek model of education, the classical model of education, was very interactive. I know when I was in graduate school, some of my instructors had been educated in European universities, and they tended to have a more European approach to education, which often mostly involves reading and discussion and critiquing and writing and that kind of stuff. And I know even as an undergrad instructor, I have largely adopted my own approach using that type of model. I never give examinations with multiple choice questions and fill in the blank and that kind of stuff. My assignments tend to be reading and critiquing and writing and doing research, and when technology is involved, it involves watching a video or a film or something and then analyzing it and then being prepared to discuss it and receive feedback on it. And I think that's the only way you really get a real education. Education involves discussion. It involves getting feedback from other people. It involves being challenged on ideas that you expressed. Not just filling in circles on a document. I've noticed that whenever students are in these large lecture hall classes where it's impossible to give papers and that kind of stuff because there's just too many of them. We have 300 students in a class, and you do grading and testing by Scantron sheets and that kind of stuff. Something is definitely lost in that process. Where there's no substitute for relatively small classes where there's a great deal of discussion and interaction, where it's almost like a conversation. When you're just sitting there with a group of 300 people, like you're watching a movie or a concert or something, and then you just memorize note from your notes to fill out a Scantron sheet a few weeks later. That something is lost there, and I think that by bringing all of this interactive technology into it, I think that even more is going to be lost, because the interpersonal aspect, I think, is critical to the educational process. So, and I don't, maybe AI will come up with a substitute for that. Like maybe we'll actually have AI figures, that function as your instructor, where it's like so you'll have all these loser students that fall in love with their AI teacher or something like that. So maybe that will be the substitute in the long run, but who knows?
All right. So as we move into final statements, I'll just say anybody that disagrees with me is doing it based on a vested class interest to not. All right. Florian, final thoughts.
Games have always been around for education. Even in the earliest times, we go back to samurai times. In other, like across the entire world, Prussian military did war games. Samurais did war games on equivalent of that, and they have been around. And basically, that's one of the primary functions computers were used. So we will have always gamification of education, and it's going to be the same in the future. If we want to make it more accessible for many people, we may have to aim at simplifying games a little bit more. The big Age of Empires like strategy games may not cut it for everyone, but there would always be games in education, and that's actually fun to watch. In the future, maybe in the future we'll all create our own games. That would be really cool.
All right, Keith, you get the last word.
Well, I don't really know that I have much more to say. I think that the delivery process for education matters, and I see some of these technological features as having a detrimental effect in some ways. There are positives in other ways. I wouldn't say there are no positives, but I do think there's a lot of negatives involved in this. So that is what it is.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Florian. And again, unfortunately, the Wi-Fi for Alek did not work, but thanks for him showing up. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.